Shalom, I'm Shani Tarragon, and welcome to the podcast Secrets of the Scroll, Hidden Messages of Megillat Esther by Matan Mizrahi, powered by the Walter Foundation. In this series, we're going to explore textual allusions, literary messages that are hidden in the text of Megillat Esther, teaching us messages of not only the story itself, but allusions to the other 23 Sfarim of Tanakh. Please join me on this remarkable journey of learning through Tanakh through the eyes of Megillat Esther. Sefer Bamidbar chronicles a nation in motion, fragile, vociferous, prone to fracture, a very fragile nation, yet sustained by divine structure, leadership. And that's why Mordechai and Esther and Megillat Esther recast basically a nation literally Bamidbar, vulnerable, in exile, and explain that we're in a very similar situation as we were in the Midbar, that we are also polarized as the stories of Bamidbar definitely are going to teach us. But perhaps even more than the various textual parallels that we're going to pay attention to in this episode, we're going to note how the themes of leadership, which really is the theme of Bamidbar, so that while Chazal calls Sefer Bamidbar Chumash HaPkudim, it is the Sefer that begins with the census, it ends with the census. It really is about the trajectory of structure and order, and all the middle prakim, the 8 stories, all carry the common theme of literally claims against leadership, the challenges to the leadership of Moshe and Aaron. And we're going to find then that this is going to be, in fact, one of the challenges of Galut. How does one live with leadership within a society that one does not fully control? How does one live literally in the Midbar? I believe that if we open up Sefer Bamidbar and we see from the very beginning the census, and not just the census, but how the census is told, already sets in motion the commentary in this case that Mordechai and Esther are going to share with us in the Megillah as well. We open up Bamidbar with, as we know, not only the census, but followed by the various countings of Am Yisrael meant to create a sense of order. A machaneh, but not just a machaneh, but after we learn about Vayikra establishing holiness through a mishkan, through an actual structure, a place of sanctity, which then concludes really the end of Vayikra, which also introduces us to life of Kedusha beyond the structure of the Mishkan. And that's why Bamidbar, in telling us about the Machaneh, also includes within it various laws. Laws, for example, of the Zav, the Mitzorah, the leper, the one of impure emissions, who must leave not only the Mikdash, as we hear about in Vayikra, but also the Machaneh. We hear about how a Kohen, who we thought was cast in Sefer Vayikra into the ivory tower of holiness of the Mishkan, how he's going to engage with thieves and with promiscuous women, and how you can even become a Nazir, literally a pseudo-Kohen in the Machaneh. All of these laws are coming to teach us that there is Kedusha in the Machaneh. So just as in our episode on Vayikra, we saw how Mordechai and Esther are teaching us how we can infuse Kedusha, even in exile, how we have to recognize that we have to picture ourselves standing in front of a Mishkan. So too, in the Machaneh, in the Midbar, one has to recognize that there is Kedusha that emanates, in fact, from the presence of the Shekhinah in our midst, but at the same time has to infuse every aspect of our lives with a sense of transcendence. And that's why Bamidbar really doesn't begin just as the conclusion or even a complement to Vayikra, the life in the Mikdash, complemented by the dynamic life in the Machaneh, but already at the end of Sefer Shmot, we hear that there are 2 functions for the Mishkan. On one hand, we're going to see how the Anan, literally a manifestation of the presence of God, how that is going to symbolize for us the not only presence of Hashem, but also, again, to know that Hashem is in our midst. which is why upon the consecration of the Mishkan, as we turn to the final chapter of Sefer Shemot, Perek Mem, Vayechas ha'anan et ol mo'ed uchvod Hashem alei et HaMishkan, we hear that just as Har Sinai was described with the anan resting above it, so too the Ohel Mo'ed, so too this meeting, this tent of meeting with Hashem, which is meant to be seen as that ongoing revelation of Har Sinai. V'lo yachol Moshe lavo el Ohel Mo'ed, ki shachana alav hanan uchvod Hashem alei et HaMishkan. Just as Moshe could not go to Har Sinai because of the anan, because of this revelation of God, so too he can't immediately enter the area of the Mishkan. This already tells us what we generally call the static function of the Mishkan, of the Shekhinah in our midst, as will be elaborated upon in Sefer Vayikra. However, the end of Sefer Shemot also serves as a prelude to the chronologically simultaneous Sefer of Bamidbar, as it introduces the other function of the Mishkan. Uve'alot hanan me'al HaMishkan yisu b'nei Yisrael b'chol masehem. The Mishkan, or really the cloud that is going to rise from the Mishkan, will serve to herald our movement, our travels in the Midbar. V'im lo ya'le'anan v'lo yisu ad yom halato ki anan Hashem al hamishkan yomam ve'esh tiyeh layla bo le'nei kol beit Yisrael b'chol masehem. Because the Amud of Anan, the Amud of Eish, basically served to tell us where to go, b'chol masehem, in our travels, recognizing that there's a function of the Mishkan literally outside of Eretz Yisrael, and a dynamic function. That's the machaneh. So how do you create order in the wilderness? How do you create order amidst chaos, basically? And the answer is pikudim. You establish unity. You establish a set order. You establish a realm of literally machaneh, Kuhuna, Leviah, Yisrael. You demarcate everyone's function within society. And the proof for this being a positive, not just framework, but paradigm for proper leadership and order within the Midbar comes at the ends of the introduction of the Machaneh of Kedusha in Bamidbar, with Moshe's invitation to Chovav, as he speaks to Chovav after the inauguration of the Mishkan by the Nesiim, representatives of the people. We note the word that's employed over and over again. How does Moshe encourage Chovav ben Reuel HaMidyani to come and accompany them to Eretz Yisrael? He says, Lacha itanu vehitzavnu lach, ki Hashem diber tov al Yisrael. This will be tov, tov, tov. Not only does he mention it twice in this pasuk, but he continues, Vayomer elav lo elech ki malartzi v'moladiti elech vayomer ana tazov otanu, ki al ken yadata chanotenu bamidbar vayita lanu le'inayim. Moshe encourages him, you'll be our tour guide. And he continues, Vahaya ki telech imanu, again that word, Vahaya, hatov hahu asher yetiv Hashem imanu ve'itavnu lach. 5 times Moshe incorporates the terminology of tov. You will see, it will be good, it will be good. We have the perfect society here, even on our temporary journey to Eretz Yisrael. Just as we found in Sefer Shemot, the Mishkan is going with us. We have the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, Chumash HaPekudim, a whole census, an order, a machaneh of Kedusha. Everything is tov, tov, tov. Vayhi ben Soa Aaron vayomer Moshe, Kum Hashem vayafutu oivecha vayanusu misanacha mipanacha. And now everything is great. Even the other nations are going to be scared. The Aaron comes before us, and they are going to scatter all of our adversaries. However, this is only the introduction to Bamidbar, because then the Torah tells us in a beautiful literary manner, after what we call the mini section, a Sefer Bifnei Atzmo, a Sefer that stands on its own as the ideal way that Am Yisrael could have, should have survived in the even temporary exile of the wilderness. Immediately thereafter, the Torah tells us, Vayhi am kemetonenim ra baznei Hashem, Vayishma Hashem vayicharapov vativ'ar bam eish Hashem, vatochal b'ksei hamachaneh. And we're going to see again, Moshe hears and Moshe sees, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to say as well, Uveinei Moshe ra, lama hare'ota lavdacha. For the 5 times that Moshe employed the terminology of tov, 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 the Torah then tells us, unfortunately, ra, 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 that every potential for good in the end turns to ra. I believe that Esther incorporates this terminology consciously, knowing that there is an ideal. There's an ideal of order. There's an ideal of unity. Even in exile, there's the ideal of literally the first 10 chapters of Sefer Bamidbar that are meant to teach us how, even temporarily, we exist outside of Eretz Yisrael. Comes along Megillat Esther and says, we know the problems. We know Sefer Bamidbar. We understand how everything turns literally upside down. And as we continue to explore Sefer Bamidbar, we're going to see that that's going to be expressed primarily through the challenge of leadership. So what term does Esther use when she realizes that her people are in a state of not just chaos, but as the Megillah itself attests to, what is the reason behind Haman's argument that the Jewish people should be annihilated without ever mentioning their actual ethnic identity? He says, Yeshno am echad mufuzar umufurad bein ha'amim. This is a nation that is completely disunified. And if they're disunified, then there really is no reason to keep them alive, which is why Esther, in risking her life on behalf of her people, what is the terminology that she says? Im al hamelech tov. I believe, as Chazal tell us, that whenever she says hamelech, she's not just talking to a king Achashverosh, but to Melech Malchei Hamlachim, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Im al hamelech tov. Hashem, you know also what a tov state of Am Yisrael is. What's tov, 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 tov? In Sefer Bamidbar, tov is when the people are in a state of unity. Tov is when they have Moshe Rabbeinu as their leader. Tov is when they have the Mishkan with the Aron to guide them. That's what tov, tov is. Hashem, I'm standing before you and saying, Im ala melech tov. And I want you to come literally, El HaMishteh. I want to have that relationship with you. I want to be able to restore the ideal setting at the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar. But what in fact actually happens in Bamidbar? Again, what turns everything awry? What transforms the tov to ra, ra, ra? The answer is at the very beginning of Perek Yud Aleph, that not only are there people on the fringe of society, but also within the Machane itself. The people who confer and literally argue against Moshe Rabbeinu. And they say, Ein kol bilti al Haman einenu. But what is their primary argument? It's really not about the food. Rather, mi yachilenu basar. It's about who is going to provide us. They're very tired of literally to have faith and trust that every morning when they walk out of their homes, there's going to be breakfast laden before them on the fields beyond their encampments. They no longer want to be dependent on HaKadosh Baruch Hu to provide them with daily food. They'd rather go to the supermarket and stock up for the next few weeks. Who knows? Maybe there will be a snowstorm. Who knows? Maybe there won't be eggs for the next little while, and therefore we may as well stock up. But we know that they're not allowed to stock up on mun. Only what they collect that morning, they have to finish that day. Everything else literally cannot be stored for the next morning. It's mi achilenu basar. Moshe Rabbeinu understands that this isn't just about a challenge of emunah, a challenge of their own trust in Hashem. He understands that they're basically undermining his religious leadership, his educational messaging. And Hashem responds to this as well by saying yes, which is why they need greater leadership, why they need Ziknei Ha'am. The antidote for proper religious messaging is greater religious leadership. That's the theme, not only of Sefer Bamidbar, but ultimately of Megillat Esther. How in the end are Am Yisrael going to be saved? Who is going to restore a certain sense of unity to this Am Echad Mufuzar Mufurad who are vulnerable to destruction? The answer is going to be leaders, as we discussed also with regard to Sefer Shmot, leaders like Moshe and Aaron, namely Mordechai and Esther. And perhaps by drawing this parallel to Bamidbar, what they're also telling us is that leadership has these dual aspects. Moshe Rabbeinu understands that complaint number one was really a religious complaint, was really not about food, again, but more about the educational messaging. And not only that, we see this underscored immediately thereafter with not only Am Yisrael complaining, but Moshe Rabbeinu's own sibling, with Miriam challenging Moshe's prophetic leadership. But that is only going to be highlighted even more by the next story, which, as we know, is the story of the sin of the spies in Sefer Bamidbar, which undermines Moshe's political leadership. The spies don't return to Moshe Rabbeinu to report their own commentary on the goings-on and the nations in the land of Israel, albeit Moshe Rabbeinu is the CEO. He's the one who sent them out. Rather, they return l'chol Yisrael. They return to the entire people instead of literally going through the channels of leadership. And therefore, after undermining Moshe Rabbeinu's political leadership, then we find once again his own cousin, Korach, undermining also political and religious leadership. What Mordechai and Esther are basically teaching us then is that the antidote for the chaos of Bamidbar is already taught to us at the beginning of Bamidbar, putting everyone in order, everyone knowing their place, not the arguments of Korach, of Kulan Kedushim, that we're all basically holy, and therefore why should you, Moshe and Aaron, Histarer Aleinu, why should you be the ones to assume higher power and authority over everyone else? Mordechai and Esther say, how are we going to solve the problem of Amachan Mufuzar Mufurad, of disunity and chaos that leads to annihilation, that leads to not only the sins, the challenges, but literally the plagues of Sefer Bamidbar? The answer they already know. They're teaching us is proper leadership. Both, as we know, political leadership, Moshe Rabbeinu responding time and time again, and through greater messages, through greater, as we know, not only with regard to the story of the Asafsuf and the Mitavim, but also with the story of Miriam, HaKadosh Baruch Hu conferring upon him, together with the Ziknei Yisrael, but a special level of Nivu'ah. Mordechai, like Moshe, recognizes that he has to respond with religious messaging together with political messaging. And therefore, in addition to tearing his clothes, he also cries. He steps up to that mantle of leadership in a political realm by going to Esther and literally telling her, commanding her, imploring of her that she has to take every political means possible, serving as an advocate for the Jewish people and unifying all of them by appearing before the king. And she recognizes the need as well and says, okay, v'kasher avaditi, but it's not enough that I'm just the leader. I will fast together with Narotai for 3 days, but that means that everyone as well. That means that we're going to bring all of Am Yisrael together. All of the Yehudim, B'chol Medinot HaMelech, we're all going to fast. That's her serving as a political leader together with the religious leadership, together through the crying. And perhaps Mordechai and Esther know as well, throughout Sefer Bamidbar, we've heard of a lot of crying. We hear about the crying after the sin of the Meraglim, the famous crying that Chazal tell us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, that was a Bechi Shel Chinam. Oh, you wait till you see. You're going to see a Bechi Shel Dorot, the future tears and the future cries. And the goal is, as Mordechai and Esther know, is not just to cry crocodile tears, but to cry genuine tears, tears of tshuva, tears of fasting, tears of recognition that HaKadosh Baruch Hu and not the pour of Haman is really what's going to determine what happens to us. And therefore, back to the story of Korach. Again, we have a relationship of cousins who basically, Korach attempting to undermine the religious and political authority of his respective cousins, Moshe and Aaron. But in the case of Mordechai and Esther, something remarkable happens. And this perhaps is why it is ultimately going to serve as the climactic point of Megillat Esther, literally a power struggle. That definitely reminds us of this climax of Sefer Bamidbar, but this time the resolution thereof. And Mordechai and Esther are thereby telling us not only what propels the continuation of the plot, but ultimately what the antidote really for any crisis of the Midbar is. And what is the antidote? Unified leadership. We discuss in Sefer Shemot the importance not just of any leadership, the dynamic illusions of Mordechai and Esther with Moshe and Aaron, the importance of mutual leadership, of joint leadership. That definitely is one of the undertones of Megillat Esther, as Yehuda is going to not only work together with Binyamin, but Binyamin is now going to symbiotically protect Yehuda. Why is this going to be so significant? Because when we open up Perek Daled, we do get a sense of a power struggle. Mordechai implores of Esther that she appear before the king with the terminology of tziva, and she herself will respond be'agidula. She hears that Mordechai is responding in a very overt manner by tearing his clothing, and she hears that he's outside of the king's gates, of the palace gates, and sends begadim lahalbish et Mordechai v'titchalchal hamalka ma'od. She's sickened even over the fact that he's wearing sackcloth, so she calls Hatach. She calls one of the eunuchs to basically give the message to Mordechai, Mazeh v'al mazeh, inquiring, what is this all about? Arousing the suspicion of us, the readers. Esther, you're in the kingdom. You're in the court of the king. How can you not know about the gzeirah, about the decree of genocide against the Jewish people? And it seems, as Mordechai even shows her the letters of decree, the Patshegen Ktav Hadat Asher Nitan B'Shushan Lahashmidan, still, Esther says, after commanded by Mordechai to appear and to beg for mercy in front of the king, and as she basically says, I can't do this. Kol avdei hamelech va'amedinot hamelech yodim asher kol ish v'isha asher yavo lamelech hachatzar hapnimit asher lo yikareh chatato lamit levad me'asher yushit lo hamelech et sharvita zahav v'chaya va'ani lo nikreti lavo lamelech ze 30 yom. In addition to allusions to many different sparim and many different ideas that we find throughout stories of Tanakh, of those that have to, in the end, appear before the king, both the mortal king, but also Melech Malchei HaMelachim, Esther here literally cowards from leadership. And she commands Mordechai, again, basically saying, I'm not going. I'm explaining to you why I can appear before the king. In which case, Mordechai and Esther, both involved in this power struggle, until Mordechai finally, without the word litzavot, lahashiv el Esther, al tidami b'nafshech limalei beit hamelech mikol haYehudim. I can still hear of Aaron Lichtenstein's Atzal's words of im hacharish tacharishi beit hazot. If you are silent, meaning all those potential leaders out there, we're all going to have these Esther moments. You're all going to have moments of Korach, where he says, okay, let's just democratize society. We shouldn't have any particular leader. And just as in Sefer Bamidbar, we see that the only way that we can exist as a people is unified together with a strong sense of clear, demarcated leadership. And yes, even though in Sefer Devarim, we're going to see that the powers of Moshe are going to be divested into different political, religious, priestly leadership. But in Sefer Bamidbar, Moshe Rabbeinu says this is what Hashem needs for now. Strong, unified political and religious leadership. That is really the message, not only of Megillat Esther, but that's the message of their commentary on Sefer Bamidbar. If it's going to be Tov, then it's going to be strong leadership that is going to step up to the plate and, together with religious and political messaging, transform Am Yisrael not only into a unified people, but one again of Kedusha that merits salvation. And therefore, we're not surprised that the tears and the cries of Sefer Bamidbar, of Chitam Raglim and Baal Peor will be transformed in Megillat Esther to cries of tshuva. This is their antidote, literally the tikkun for Sefer Bamidbar. We shouldn't be surprised then that Sefer Bamidbar ends after 8 stories of challenge to leadership, how it ends with literally the ends of this leadership, but at the same time, unity restored, another census. The people are counted again. And not only are the people counted again for the sake of nachala, for the sake of territory, but again, we hear of women who step up as leaders, benot Tzlofchad, who say we also have to be counted because counting means identity. And therefore, they're not really claiming that they need to be counted for the sake of inheritance, but rather, Lama Yigara Shem Avinu Mimishpachto. Just as Mordechai turns to Esther and says, Al titami es nafshech li malei beit hamelech mikol hayudim, ki im hacharish tacharishi beit hazot revach batala yamod liyudim mimakom acher va'at ubeit avich tovedu. And therefore what he tells her is, you are responsible, Esther, for continuing the legacy of your father Avichail. And this is their reference back to Benot Tzlofchad, who basically say, we're the ones who stood up for our father's legacy, and therefore that's what has to be perpetuated. Everyone in Sefer Bamidbar in the end is going to be counted. Because when you count, not only do you matter, but when you count, you survive, you perpetuate, you ensure continuity. And that aspect of continuity through not just leadership, but through counting, is going to counter forever the Amachan Mufuzar Mufurad Bein Ha'amim. If you count, you matter, and thereby you survive. I don't think that it's by chance that Megillat Esther ends, to a certain degree, in a very similar manner as Bamidbar. Not only with the brachot of Bil'am, Matovu Alecha Yaakov Mishkanotecha Yisrael, recognizing the beauty of the unity and the tzniut of all of Am Yisrael, but also countering, as we know, the ends of Bamidbar with the story of idolatry and a story of adultery, a Baal Peor. The antidote for that literally is restructuring Am Yisrael, of bringing the mishpachot back together, of counting not only the people, but every mishpacha or mishpacha, that the only way that we can form and reform ourselves as a nation, the only way that we can unify and solidify a vociferous people, is if we reestablish batim, as if we recount everyone based on their family. When Benot Tzlov say, this is for the sake of mishpacha, that's when HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Kein Benot Tzlov Dovrot. When we are finally a family again, after homes are destroyed and families are destroyed, then we're a nation that counts again. Then we're a nation that we find at the very end of Sefer Bamidbar is not just going to be a nation that is unified, not only a nation that is blessed, but also, as we know, the end of Sefer Bamidbar teaches us not only of the counting of Am Yisrael, but ultimately reviews all the travels, the trials, and the tribulations, and ends with the prelude, really, to coming to Eretz Yisrael. Megillat Esther, in a very similar vein, basically tells us everything is set. Everything is set now, that you have proper leadership, religious and political leadership. Now, Esther HaMalkah says, the next stage is, in fact, for all of us to come together, and Esther HaMalkah rewrites the story again of Megillat Esther, and sending together with Mordechai HaYehudi et Kol Tokef lekayem et Igeret HaPurim Hazot Hashenit. It's almost reminiscent of the second counting, really, of Bamidbar, sending out these letters by Yishlach Sfarim, and similar to the term also of misparim, of the sipur and the mispar, the counting of the people. And what does she tell them to do? Lekayem et yemei hapurim ha'ele bizmanehem, kasher kiyam alehem Mordechai HaYehudi v'Esther HaMalkah, v'kasher kimu al nafsham b'el zaram divrei hatzomot v'zakatam. That za'akah, the cry, appears. But this time, it's a cry that ultimately should alter the trajectory of Am Yisrael, even though we're a little disappointed, because really, Megillat Esther, Esther and Mordechai tell us, could end the same way that Bamidbar does, not just with the blessing, but with the preparation of entering Eretz Yisrael. With family and unity restored, we're now anticipating, okay, now is the time that everyone should prepare to join the rest of Shabbat Zion. And yet, Omamar Esther Kiyam Divrei HaPurim Ha'ele V'nechtav B'Sefer. In the end, it's written down for perpetuity, but unfortunately, it doesn't become the real story. Here we find, to a certain degree, the tragic end of Megillat Esther, as opposed to Bamidbar, where the chaos is restored and the counting solidifies the people. In Megillat Esther, it stays on a level of the ideal without being translated into reality. The hope, perhaps, that Mordechai and Esther are telling us is that this is the never-ending story, that we can always write the continuation. We can take what's written and actually make it count.
Thank you for joining us for Secrets of the Scroll with Rabbanit Shani Targin. This series is presented by Matan and World Mizrahi and powered by Walder Foundation. We hope today's conversation inspired you, sparked new ideas, and deepened your connection to the text and its meaning. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends or family who would appreciate these conversations. Your support helps us continue bringing thoughtful, meaningful Torah to the wider audience. We look forward to learning together again soon. See you in the next episode of Secrets of the Scroll with Rabbanit Shani Targin.